This is Gemara in Shavuos, Daf. Hey, we are holding on Dalet Amud Beis, about 10 lines from the bottom. The first one on line is Af Al Pi, and we like all the learning to be an incredible schos refuah shlema for Tinok ben Miriam Ahuva b'soich shar chayli Yisrael. So we're in the middle of a lengthy discussion, Riboy Mio to Riboy Shitas Rebbe. That's what we're holding. Now we ended off that Rebbe subscribes to the concept of riboy umiyot v'riboy. Asks the Gemara, Amar le Ravina la Meimar. Ravina asks Ameimar, Rebbe Darish riboy miyot, Rebbe Darish ribuyu miyuti. Does Rebbe really darshan such? Well, Rebbe klali uprati darish. But we find elsewhere that Rebbe subscribes to a different methodology. And of course, in as much as they're similar, Riboy it includes, Miyad is it specifies, Klal is it's general, Prat is it's individualized, but the results are very different. Now, obviously, the fine nuances, how to know when to use each of the Yud Gimel Miyados Shatar and Nijashas Ram is complicated. But I ask the Gemara, we find the Rebbe Darshan's Klali Uprati. Titani, we learned in a Braisa. Martzeya says by an Eved Ivri, if an Eved Ivri chooses to remain with his master, Martzeya, you make a hole in his ear with a awl. Ein li ala Martzeya. Minayin the Rabbis, how do we know Asol Vasir v'amachav v'mekadeach? Other instruments that can make a hole. How do we know? You could also use those. V'hamichtav, a stylus. How do we know you can use any of those? Tamaloymar says the pasuk. V'lokach, you should take kol davar shenilkach biyad divrei Rav Yosi b'Rav Yehuda. Any item that can be taken in the hand. Rabbi Omer Martzeya, Ma Martzeya miyuchad shal mateches. Av kol shal mateches has to be something of metal specifically. V'amrinan, and over there we wondered and we asked. What is this machlekes reviewed in Rabbi? Whether it's anything that's nilkach biyad to make the hole, or whether it's davka martzeya. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Darish klali uprati. Rabbi Yehuda Darish, as we turn over to Hey Amid Aleph, today's daf. Rabbi Yehuda Darish's what? Ribuye umiyute. So ask the Gemara, we just finished saying that Rabbi Darshins ribuye umiyut. But we find in the Gemara Kedushin and B'chayros, not that way. That it's Rabbi Yehuda Shita, the Darshins Riboy Umiyot. Answers the Gemara in true. Ba'alma Klali Uprati Darsh. In general, Rabbi Darshins Klali Uprati, like we learned over there by the Eved Ivri, Dafkot has to be similar to the Prat, has to be made out of metal. But by us, what is the reason? The Rebbe is darshaning riboy umiyot. K'detan dvei Rabbi Yishmael. Detan dvei Rabbi Yishmael b'mayim. Says the pasuk b'mayim shnei pamim. 2 times b'mayim. Ein ze klalu prat. This is not a klalu prat. El riboy umiyot. So Rebbe agrees like Rabbi Yishmael, and therefore by us, he has to hold its riboy umiyot. So it comes out that Shitas Rebbe will be subjective to the context. That over there, Hinachanami, he darshans call you prati. But by us, it's riboy umiyot. V'Rabbanan, asked the Gemara, Amar Avina, Kedami b'marava kol makom she'atamotzi shtei klalos hasmucha zeh lezeh. Anytime we find 2 klalos next door to each other, says the Gemara, Hatel prat beinayim v'doinim b'klalu prat. Put the prat between them and darshin and dan them utilizing a klalu prat. And therefore says the Gemara, Hashta da'amid Rebbe klalu prati darish bal karchach kasha shvuos. So going full circle, and of course, this is one of those Gemaras that you really have to learn the whole progression to really gain the depth of what's going on. But says the Gemara, once we're of the understanding that Rebbe Darshan's Klali Uprati, we have no choice but to Darshan, we have no choice, that our Mishnah of Shavuos is shver, that even though it's a stam Mishnah, it can't be shitas Rebbe, and rather says the Gemara b'Shavuos, Nasiv aliv Rabbi Akiva, v'lei lo sfir lei Rebbe must be codified and written our Mishnah not aliba to his own opinion, but rather aliba to Rabbi Akiva, but he really does not hold of it at all. Says the Gemara, okay, that wraps up the previous sugya. Once again, go through from A to Z, it'll be much easier. But continues the Gemara, Gufa. Minayin she'nachayev alal she'ish b'yediyah b'tchila b'yediyah v'soif v'hela b'intayim. How do we know? The din of the Mishnah. The Mishnah taught us, or the Brisa really at the end of Daf Dalid, Amud Aleph, that the only time you're chayev the carbon oil v'yared, again, we learned to the Mishnah, a carbon that determines on one's wealth. Wealthy, an animal; less wealthy, a bird; even less, a mincha. How do we know that that's only going to be a chiyuv? If there's a yediyah, you're aware of what you did b'tchila b'asayif, and in the middle there is this helem. Talmud Leimar says the Gemara, v'nelem shtei pamim divri Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Omer ino tzarach Hari Omer v'nelem michlal sheyada v'hu yada. Harikan shtei yediyos. Imkain, if that's true, matam lever v'nelem the chayav ala elem toma val elem mikdash. So we have a machlekes Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi, says the Gemara, whether it's because v'nelem shtei pamim, or Rabbi says no, we don't learn it out from v'nelem, but rather nelem teaches us if something is ne'elam, concealed, that means you must have known something. But the Torah then continues and says, V'hu yada. Shkayach, of course you knew something if it was v'nelem. So from here we learn there's two types of yediyos, with a nelem in the middle. That's yediyas hamikdash, and helem hamikdash, and helem hatoma. Amar Mars quotes this brisa we just said. V'nelem achlal sheyada. Says where my mashma. How do you know that v'nelem means that you're aware? Amar Rava midloika say v'hi aluma mimenu. For the fact that it does not say, and it was hidden from him, and rather it says, and it was concealed. Says the Gemara, that shows it was something he knew, and then he did not have that knowledge afterwards. Says by 1 second. Says by Saita was concealed from the eyes of her husband. So if we can have the same diok, that would show us that in the world of Saita he knew about it at the beginning. But ask the Gemara, 1 second, if you knew about the Aveira that was done, if the wife is aware of the Aveira, says the Gemara, then we have a very serious problem, because then the Me'amarim doesn't work. If the husband knew, V'atanya, we learned in a brayso of an Akesh Me'avain V'isha Ha'itisa as Avaina, and the man will be clear of sin, and the wife will have the Avera. From here we darshan in the Gemara in Saita, V'zan Sheish Menuka Me'avain Ha'maye Boitkin Es Ishtoi. Only when the husband is clear of Avera, that's when the waters work. But Einish Menuka Me'avain. But if the husband is not, then Einamayim Boitkin Es Ishtoi. And therefore, says the Gemara, if Vinela means that it was known prior, there'd be no Saita Bechlal, Visu. And furthermore, says the Gemara, Kabei Torah Dechsev in Elma Me'inei Kol Chai, U'meyofa Shemayim Nistera. It says regarding the Torah, it was concealed from the eyes of everyone, and for those who are Oifa Shemayim, flying in heaven, it was hidden. Are you going to tell me that there's someone who knew about the full extent of the Torah? No one knew its extent. So ask the Gemara, what are we going to say? Ella Amar Abaya Kasava Rebbe Yedias Beis Rabbi Shema Yediyah. Says the Gemara, you know what Rebbe holds? One who knows something Beis Rabbi, that is enough. Every child knows that if you touch something tameh, he is tameh. So Rebbe says that is called a yediyah in the beginning. He just didn't realize that it fulfills and it's within the Torah. It's within the context of what he's learning right now. Says Mara, wait, we were just so broad. We just learned that it's Yediyah Beis Rabbi, the fact you learned it as a child. Let's take a moment to see Rashi. Rashi, towards the top of the Amid, says, Shalom Beis Rabbi. What do you learn? He knew he touched something. Losam Alibais, the Gemara is splitting a hair and saying, Yuvada knew. You knew that touching Tumah makes you Tameh. You just didn't think about it. Shenitma, says the Gemara Chiddush, that's going to call Yediyah. The Gemara now flips the page and the Gemara says, Papa asked Abaya, 1 second. Says, so then what's the case of lack of Yediyah? Everyone knows. So Amar Leah, Abayer sons in Yerai, Meshachasla, you know what the case is going to be? A Mayra Dika Chiddush. The only case that you'll be lacking a Yediyah B'tchila is when you mamish never knew. You never learned the basics of basics. That one is Tinuk Shenishba. He grew up captured by the Goyim. Continues the Gemara, Yitzia Shabbos Shtayim Shehein Arba. Yitzia of Shabbos, the case number 2 that our Mishnah brought was Shabbos is 2, which is 4. Tanan Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah, Yitzia Shabbos Shtayim Shehein Arba Bifnim, Shtayim Shehein Arba Bachot, Maishna Achot, Tani Shtayim Shehein Arba V'Sulai, Maishna Achot, Tani Shtayim Shehein Arba Bifnim, Shtayim Shehein Arba Bachot. Ask the Gemara over there, Mesechus Shabbos, it doesn't just leave it as 2, which is 4, but rather over there it goes and it gives you more details. Ask the Gemara why. Answers the Gemara, Hasam Dikar Shabbos Tani Avos V'Toldais. Hacha Delavik Shabbos Avos Tani V'Toldais Loi Tani. Over here we didn't list the whole gamut of everything. Ask the Gemara, Avos Maininu. What are the case of Avos? Yitziyos. Yitziyos Tarti Avon. If you remember this, we had this whole shag with Arya and Shabbos, and the Chivan Leptor. Vadimi Demaris Kedayim Ketani. Masam Kula Chiyuva, Vacha Kula Chiyuva. Elam Rababa comes in Rababa and he says, Ha, some Dekar Shabbos, Tani Chiyuva Peturi. Hacha Chiyuva Tani. Peturi Loi Tani. Over there, Nachamol, it's Dekar Shabbos, so we like Chiyuvim and Peturim. But over here, we just write the Chiyuvim and not the Peturim. Says Mer Chiyuvim Ayninu, Yitziyos. Yitziyos Tarti Udavan. Shtayim Da'itza. Answers the Gemara, Shtayim Da'chnasa. 2 going out and 2 going in. Aiva Yitziyos Ketani, and coming in is not a Hoitza, it's Hachnasa. Amar Ravashi Tana Chnasa Nami Hoitza Karila. The Tana calls, bringing in, calls that Hoitza. Mimai. From where do we know this? As we turn over to Hayamid Bey, says the Gemara, how do we know that the term Hoitza can be utilized even for Hachnasa, for bringing something in? Says the Gemara, Tetanan. We learned in the Mishnah in Shabbos, Hamoitzi Rishos Rishos, you bring out from one Rishos to the next Chayiv. We're not talking about a case that you bring in from one Rishos to the next and call it Aitzah. So too by us. Ask Mara, wait. But Dilma, Kamav Rishos Yachal Rishos Rabbim. Maybe it means you're going for Rishos Rishos Rabbim, and therefore it is indeed a Aitzah towing out. Says the Gemara, "Mkein nisni hamoitzi merishos hayachal rishos hayachal." My merishos lirishos should have said hamoitzi rishos hayachal rishos haram. Why does he just rishos to rishos? That's a very inclusive, includes all cases. Ta'afilu, it even includes 6 lines down rishos haram rishos hayachal, and yet the kakari le'oitza. So our Tana is going to hold the same. Says the Gemara, okay, but l'maisa v'tayim amai. If it's going in, why are you calling it aitzah? Answers the Gemara, Tana koli kiras chayvetz mimekayma. Anytime the chayvetz leaves its place, aitzah karila is called going out. Amar Ravina Masisin Amideika. The Mishnah is precise. The Mishnah on Shabbos, and we then explains, bring it in. So must be it's called Yitziyos. Rava Amar Rishuyas Ketani Rishuyas Shabbos Shtayim, says Rava, when the term Yitziyos, the Yitziyos is referring to the Rishus and the Rishus of Shabbos, there are two Rishuyos, of course, Rishus Yachid and Rishus Harabim. That was a nice Chazara back from that which we learned in Mesechus Shabbos. We wrap up today's share with Marais Negayim Shnayim Shein Harba. Says the Gemara Tanan also, we learned in the Mishnah, Marais Negayim Shnayim Shein Harba, 2 which is 4. What is the 2 which is 4? And of course, always Siyat the Shemayat, we learned about Marais Negayim the week of Tazriyah Mitzayra. Baheres Azak Kisheleg. What is it? Says the Gemara, Baheres, that's very white like snow. Shniya, what secondary law is Kisira Heichel, like the line by the Heichel. Seis, Kitsemer Lavan, like the white wool. Shniya law is Kikrum Beya, like the white of an egg. Amar of Chanina Mantani Maros Negayim, Deloik Rabbi Akiva. Why? Ti Rabbi Akiva, Akiva Damar Zulamala Mizu, says the Gemara, because according to Rabbi Akiva, this one is above this one, this one above this one. Imkain, Tiharta Sidaichal, Militzarif. If it's true, the Mishnah says that it's primary and secondary, then it's not Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because Sidaichal will not combine with anything else. Why not? Says the Gemara. B'hadi man litzarfi. Litzarfi v'hadi b'heres. Ikaseis ta'adifa min eseis is greater. Litzarfi v'hadi eseis. Lav told the D-Day, so it has to be the Av and its total, the primary, the Ikar and its secondary. So the Sida Eicha will never have anything to combine. So it cannot be Rabbi Akiva's. Rabbi Akiva does allow it to combine. Says the Gemara 3 lines to Labana, but if that is true, the Mamish the same thing in the next case. What is the Krumbeya Mitzarfit? Let's start about this. He can say, no, start about this. Lav bar minehu. So says the Gemara, the Mishnah seemingly is not compatible, cannot be Shitas Rabbi Akiva. Shitas Rabbi Akiva. Before we turn over the Amir, let's just see Rashi, how he speaks this out. Rashi, 3 lines to the bottom, brings us into the Gemara that we're going to see tomorrow. That says, Maris Degam Zulam Al Mizu, which really is what we're explaining right now. That Nishna Kiseder Malasam, the reading in order of intensity. Hashelig Vatzemer Hasid Vakrum. And we're going to see tomorrow in Davav. Shekiseder Mishnasam He Mitzarfin Zelazeh. Veinecham Mitzarf Ligavoyim and Ushtimal. You can't jump 2 levels, just 1. Problem is, it's going to come out, it'll feed this understanding that according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no way for anything to combine with each other. So we turn over to Vavam and Aleph, continuing this discussion. Really, this is going to take us well into tomorrow's daf, but just for 1 more minute, says the Gemara, Hi Mai, what's going on over here? 1 second. I understand. Krumbeya loikash. Why not? Davagad the Krumbeya mitatoi dis ace. Even though Krumbeya is below seis, still Rachman Amar l'seis labachas. Sabachas tefillah l'seis. Avgav de menachas minom. Even though it is much lower, tuva. Elisida echol kasha. Elamachavarta masnisa. And the like Rabbi Akiva says the Mar, you're right. The Mishnah can't be Rabbi Akiva. We're going to stop over here. And the next year, we're actually going to go into what is the Shittas Rabbi Akiva, which then we'll circle back around and add a lot of clarity.